Okay, it looks like we're all seated and ready to go. So my name's Alan Foster, and I am, for good, better, or for worse, responsible for the next few tracks that we have coming up here. I spoke, connived, begged the various presenters to get their slides together and do these presentations. So authorization is something that's near and dear to my heart. I get to go at the very end of all of the sessions. So to start everything off, I want to introduce Eve Mailer, XML girl, the queen humanitarian, all of the various topics with it to come and talk about Federated Authorization Nirvana, a very Seattle name.
I didn't pick it. I'll tell you the story. Well, thanks, Alan. All right, so actually I want to thank Andy Hindle for the name. He's the one who came up with it, so he's not anywhere near Seattle. But in truth, we've got a problem, and we're looking for Nirvana. Enterprises are porous by design these days, and people need to share information selectively. And we've got an Internet of Things that makes constraining data flow kind of hard. So yeah, in truth, we're actually looking for something like a federated authorization Nirvana. And that sounds like maybe a good fit for a solution for all these problems. So I'm here to talk about a potential solution that's called User Managed Access, or UMA. Some people pronounce it UMA, but humanitarians call it UMA. And this is its architecture. And I want to describe it a little bit, and then we can start to take a look at what it's good for and see if it's a good fit. So, by the way, you'll find a couple of URLs and a Twitter handle there where you can find more information. So, some properties of this architecture, which we do call the marvelous spiral for good reason. Number one, we've got a resource owner, that's a name taken from OAuth, I'll tell you about that a little bit more in a second, who wants to achieve a whole bunch of purposes: delegation, consent, revocation of that consent, denial of requests for access, conveniently in a single place, which here we call an authorization server. We've also got, well, we've got a resource server. In fact, we've got potentially many resource servers, as many resource servers as you like, that need to serve as single sources of truth, if you will, distributed single sources of truth. Because as we know, the world is full of many sources of truth of who we are, what we do, what we care about. And we've got a requesting party over here. In fact, we've got as many distinct parties with whom a resource owner, somebody, an individual, or maybe an organization in the world wants to share with. So we've got kind of three planes of interesting things. We've got what you want to share, how you want to share it, and who you want to share it with, all distinct. So what's a challenge that we want to share? Kind of a big use case bucket. Challenge number one, building trusted digital relationships. I actually love this image. Building relationships over many barriers. What do I mean by that? What I mean is organizations specifically building trusted digital relationships with individuals, which is a hard thing to do these days with all the cynicism and the increased savviness in the world of individuals in what now everybody calls the post-Snowden era. Demonstrably, everybody is kind of not having really good relationships with organizations and their trustworthiness. So I want to share with you some real-life scenarios where UMA is being worked with, being POC'd, being considered. And the first one is an attribute sharing scenario, identity attribute sharing scenario, being looked at in a government context. So this is a picture from an Open Identity Exchange, OIX UK project, which is being presented, I don't know, maybe it was already presented or is being presented tomorrow, where Warwickshire City Council, Department of Works and Pensions in the UK, and some others are all working together to arrange for kind of a minimal disclosure attribute sharing scenario that's consented using OAuth and OpenID Connect technologies. Now, they're using those two technologies. What could make it even better, perhaps? Well, for one, the kind of longitudinal consent technologies that they're using, they've had to build some extra special proprietary smarts into them. In addition, what they'd like to do is a place to go online, this is a direct quote from some of the materials, where citizens can see and manage all the consents they have given to different organizations, in this case meaning agencies, government agencies. So that's something they can't achieve right now, is kind of that longitudinal view. So that's one use case that we're looking at, not just for government, but for others. Second use case is a health use case, a data donation scenario. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more in a moment, but UMA is being profiled by an organization, a working group called HEART, Health Relationship Trust. Come see the talk tomorrow morning with me and Debbie Bucci. We're the co-chairs of this group called HEART. And so OAuth and OpenID Connect and UMA and a health-specific API called FHIR are being profiled for, this is one of the use cases where you might want to donate health data about you for clinical research in a de-identified way. So this is one of the diagrams showing that. Health is some of the most sensitive personal data there is. Now, why enable personal data sharing? So sticking with this health use case, we've collected data in this use case work that we're doing there on this health use case, and I don't have time to share all that data with you, but it's actually in the linked use case, and I can share that later off the stage. Well, data accuracy is really important. If it comes from the source of truth, rather than having to aggregate it in one place and tamper-proof it and do all that work, go to the source permissioned by the central authorization server. So that's a health use case, but applies to everything. Attributes of any sort, or data of any sort, or content of any sort that's about you. Clinical research is a health use case, but data mashups of all kinds of purposes are another use case. Sharing data in a permission fashion for marketing purposes is a use case I actually just talked to somebody about just the other day. These are real use cases. And then better care in the health use case. I saw a talk given by Philips Healthcare where they did a study with Banner Health, and I will share this because the numbers are so amazing, on whether you could actually have shorter, less emergency room intensive stays in the hospital based on IoT devices and sort of companion mobile apps. And in this, I can't remember the kind of chronic health issue there was in this case, but they were finding that over the course of a year, you could save 10 days in the hospital and $27,000 by use of this data sharing, personal data sharing, significant numbers. So it could be that you're sharing selectively light bulb access in your house when it's all smart light bulbs. It could be that you're sharing tax data with your accountant. These are all realistic scenarios that I've been talking to people about. So, okay, personal data flows, that sounds great for businesses. Why should businesses go to the trouble of building in personal control of this access? Well, a couple of reasons. In the web app era, or the mobile era, which is really the API economy era, it was easy to see that businesses' interests didn't align perfectly with individual interests. So UMA looks like a nice to have. I've often said that, OAuth and APIs go together like peanut butter and chocolate. I was made fun of for talking about peanut butter and chocolate yesterday at the Kantara workshop. But in the IoT era, things really start to heat up for a technology like UMA because party-to-party sharing, person-to-person sharing, what humanitarians call Alice to Bob sharing, come to the fore. You can see it in CareKit, which implemented an Alice to Bob sharing flow, if proprietarily. Why do I have socks up there? Those are smart socks, clearly. Why would somebody wear smart socks versus dumb socks? Yes, they do exist. They're made in Seattle. Anyone wear smart socks? People who know my... It's how far apart your feet are when you run. So if you're an elite marathoner, for example, or you have plantar fasciitis, or you want to find out where your feet strike on the ground, a company called Sensoria, somebody shouted up on the stage when I talked about them before, and where do I get them? Sensoria.com is the answer. Dumb socks don't generate data. Smart socks do. And this is data that you don't necessarily just want to access yourself using some app. You want to share it with a doctor or a coach, and not on Facebook, I presume. These are not social sharing use cases. These are selective sharing use cases in a non-social sense. So that's a new set of use cases that come from what I think of as the greed end of the continuum, not the fear end of the continuum of data sharing. Businesses want to satisfy those. They are satisfying those. And then the second use case, yes, new regulatory pressures. Any business that touches an EU citizen now in any way, not in a creepy way, I hope, has probably taken note of the just ratified General Data Protection Regulation. There's this privacy shield. These are things that you have to take note of, and those are kind of for your bottom line for a risk view of the universe. So another use case bucket that is starting to become really important the more I talk to companies is make the right thing to do be the easy thing to do in the enterprise. Now, why do I have John Gilmore up there? So, with apologies to John Gilmore, and I think Alan knows what's coming, here's a saying from our dear Alan Foster. The enterprise interprets access control as damage and routes around it. How many of you have ever been forced to email a file around when you somehow couldn't give access you admit it, the proper way? Yes. This is just yes. This is Justin's brick in the door slide that he's shown so many times. So, I mean, whether it's giving somebody the password, the more you share it, the less it's a secret, or whether it's mailing a file around, this is what we resort to do when we don't have constrained delegation of access. So some use cases of federated authorization architecture like UMA, centralized management of the scopes you're giving out to your API-fronted applications. And enterprises are now generating hundreds, nay, thousands of applications that are API-fronted. I mean, all the enterprises I talk to are now API first, if they at all can be. And they've got partner employees who are trying to get access to these. They're using SaaS services. They're maybe using partner services. It's a highly loosely coupled environment. When I started by saying enterprises are porous, I mean, that almost doesn't even describe it. I was going to say it's really bad. It's not bad. It's great. We just need some kind of control over this. And you know, we're sort of getting desperate. So that use case is very alive for me. It looks like Google Docs with a share button, only not proprietary. We want that for our apps, all of our apps. So why enable that? Well, okay, security. I just talked about emailing content and sharing passwords. By the way, we're starting to get out of the password-only era. Hey, where'd my slides go? Hey. So, you know, sharing passwords is starting not to be an option. I mean, it's even not an option when I want to use Amazon Prime Video. I know my husband's going to get a text, and recently I wanted to watch something, and I didn't have that enabled on my tablet or whatever, and he was away on the East Coast where I wasn't, and it was going to text him in the middle of the night. Oh, that's bad. 2FA, inconvenient, but right. Governance, you know, when it's more than just SaaS services, when we're making our own API services and we're using partner services, we want governance over our access to that. We want governance over our partner employees' access to our stuff. It's all loosely coupled. I was talking at EIC recently, the European Identity and Cloud Conference, and I was asked when I was on the stage, okay, so what's the deal with microservices and, you know, all this stuff? And I said, well, there's only 3 problems with microservices: identity, security, and privacy. Small things. We need governance over all of those layers of that stuff too. So, and finally, I mentioned IoT here because more than anything else, you see streaming data, you see API-fronted methods of accessing this stuff, and it's not amenable to sharing passwords and all that. You need governance over access to that too. And it's at the level of kind of, you know, sensors are kind of microservice controlled. Okay. Last thing, I don't have a countdown here, so I don't know how I'm doing. I think I'm doing okay. Why formalize loosely coupled authorization? Why make a standard in this case? Well, number one, APIs have business owners now. And I know, because I'm talking to people about this, they're struggling to get control out of the hands of devs for permission management. And what's possible to do in the UMA loosely coupled architecture of resource server versus authorization server is the API owner has authority over what counts as a resource to be protected and what counts as scopes over that resource. And it's valuable to put control of that into whoever the API owner is, whether that's an enterprise architect lead or whether it's a product manager, what I like to call APIs for fun and profit, which is the game now, baby. And secondly, well, formalizing security APIs, which is kind of what you're looking at when you look into the UMA specifications, is a good thing because it's repeatable, it's standardizable, you can test for conformance. This is the kind of thing that CIOs and CISOs actually love. Better than the alternative. Okay. So what are the underpinnings of all this? So you guys know, who doesn't know OAuth roughly? Who doesn't know how it works, or who needs a really detailed? I'll go fast because I have to for time. I'm now being given an accurate view of how much time I have. Thank you. Time just went so fast before my eyes. All right, so here's how I like to describe OAuth in a nutshell. Who remembers WS security, actually? Who's as old as me? I'm very, very old. Okay, I like to say it does RESTful WS security, meaning it puts a token in the authorization header of a web services call, roughly, except that it added a cool thing, which is user consent. It conceived of the resource owner as a person, and it innovated around being able to revoke the token, which is really cool. So, I mean, the way it works is we've got Alice, a resource owner. She authorizes, that is to say, consents after authenticating. A little bit of a cheat there, no sort of policy. And I've got a use case of Google Drive and a third-party ecosystem of clients in the picture. What gets the consent, what gets the authorization is a client application. So not strictly the company running the app or who made the app, but the app. The company might have had multiple apps. So this is a very technical view, not really a legal view, but a technical view. The two endpoints, authorization endpoint and the token endpoint, that's OAuth, roughly. And then we have however many value-add endpoints there are that make up the API that's being protected. I made 5. I don't know how many there actually are for Google Drive. It's just I just made 5 little dots. Importantly, you can expect that all those endpoints, all 7 in the picture, are run by the same organization. In other words, if you want to go revoke the token, you've got to go back to Google in this case. That's where the token gets revoked. So it's basically a pairwise exercise. Now I put OpenID Connect in this picture. I'm not going to have enough time to go through this. You can go get the slides. But I found that this slide is really popular for describing how OpenID Connect is kind of a unioning of federated single sign-on features in OAuth. So I'll leave it in here. If anybody wants to take a quick picture, I'll let you do the photo op. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You can go get it later, I promise. And now I just want to describe UMA's kind of value add on top of plain OAuth, and it's based on these two technologies. It adds party-to-party, Alice to Bob, asynchronous, don't have to be present to win, scope-grained, delegation, and control to OAuth, to plain OAuth. So we've got a resource owner that could be Alice or explicitly could be an enterprise. We've got a Bob over there, but it could also be an enterprise on the requesting party side. Let me break this down. First big addition is the resource server and the authorization server are formally loosely coupled. There's an API that the authorization server presents to the resource server. Resource server is a client to that API. It's called a protection API. So to onboard anything you want protected centrally, you talk to an endpoint to register it. And there's some other endpoints that manage the process of that loose coupling. Second thing, there's a Bob. And that's a formal notion, so we're starting to actually build a legal notion of how you share with a third party and make it okay. Third thing, well, okay, Alice can configure an authorization server and then go away. That's what makes it asynchronous. So it's no longer authenticate and authorize a token to be issued, but now you got to test Bob. Is it okay for him to get through? So now it's starting to look like traditional, maybe web access management or something, only it's for Alice's stuff wherever it lives, which is kind of cool. User managed access. It does what it says on the tin. We call that process trust elevation. And there's actually kind of a flexible way of testing whether Bob's okay. By identifier, by claims, actually claims, identifier is just a subset of what claims are, step-up authentication, a whole bunch of ways. And then finally, there's some subsidiary tokens in the mix, which is why we give names to all these tokens. So there's a process of consent to sew together the loosely coupled pieces. I want to just rush quickly to see if there's time for any questions. What's going on with UMA lately? What's the status? We reached v1.0.1 of our specs in December of last year. There's a growing number of implementations. We have an implementation page on our wiki, including several open source, including several IoT, which is really interesting, kind of IoT focused. I mentioned we're being profiled by the Health Relationship Trust work group out of OpenID Foundation. There's a companion UMA developer resources work group where some client library stuff is being developed to seed the ecosystem. We have a nice liaison relationship with the consent and information sharing work group if you've been following the consent receipt conversation here at the conference. I mentioned the legal work. We're actually developing model clauses, not like EU model clauses, but a little similar, legal boilerplates, so you could put that into agreements and even consent receipts to say what you wanted to share, what you did share, what agreements you forged with an authorization server, for example, as a resource owner. And we've got a number of roadmap items for this year, including everything you see there. Wide ecosystem means Alice wants to share with Bob. She knows Bob in the real world, but the relevant systems never met each other before, no pre-established trust. MPD, as I mentioned yesterday in the Kantara workshop, does not mean multiple personality disorder. It means multi-party delegation. It's work that Justin, I think, and crew may have worked on together that are turning into a set of really interesting and good change proposals that we are working through right now that address quite a lot of those sub-bullets. And I anticipate that we'll probably get through that very interesting and good list shortly if the conference season would ever end. I have the URLs there again. I encourage you to go follow us on Twitter and consider joining the group if you want to get involved. And that is the end of the formal presentation. I have a couple minutes for questions or comments. Stunned silence. No, yes.
In your diagram a few slides back, you had a breakout between client and requesting party. Is that unique to UMA? I haven't heard those two distinguished in just regular life.
It is distinguished. That is a difference between, yeah, this is sort of the top level of differences. That is, I just said 4 main differences. That is a distinction. So the addition of the, no, I guess I did go over it. The addition of the requesting party is new, and it's precisely to manage the fact that there's a party, a legally responsible party that you're sharing with, and they might be using any client. So it's possible for Alice to create, let's say, a policy condition constraining what client ID to share with if she wants to, and other policy conditions that constrain elevation of trust in Bob himself. Or, I mean, I didn't give you a full picture of all the policy conditions she could make. It could be non-uniquely identifying. Only citizens of the UK may get access to my resource. Only, you know, whatever. Like, this is why, you know, there is or was a trust elevation TC in OASIS. And the traditional conversation around testing for suitability in this fashion has been very identifier-centric, because I think it's all been around identification and authentication and step-up authentication. We just conceived of it initially as claims gathering, and claims could be non-uniquely identifying. And then we actually broadened it further, and we actually have a very extensible little trust elevation protocol in there. And lately I've been involved in some conversations where people want to put smart contracts into there, dare I say. And I'm quite interested in that because we've talked about, well, you could have a payment engine. I will sell you access to my high-res photos. This is not just about, sort of PII. And if you give me a receipt for $5, I'll give you access to my photo. Well, I'll give you $5 if you give me access to your photo first. Ah, escrow sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? Hence, smart contracts coming into it. So there's a lot of things you could do right in there. And so whether we build that in this time around or whether we just continue to make it nice, clean extensibility is up for question right now. But so requesting party is indeed very new. Well, new with UMA, not a concept in OAuth. It's just client app. And therefore, that's why I said if I go back to this, it's a client app, and you're kind of assuming you're giving access to Insightly. What you're giving access to is actually a particular Insightly app with a particular client ID. And they might have 5 client IDs, and you'll have to give access to each one of them, and it's not to that company specifically, even though that company implicitly will have whatever access you gave them, if that makes any sense. And I think I've run out of time now. I'm going into positive numbers, which is a weird signal to give me. All right, I'll wrap up. Thank you very much. I'll stay after.